At Thanksgiving dinner, my son-in-law looked me straight in the eye and sneered, "Get a job and stop freeloading off your own children." His father laughed and added, "That's rich coming from you. Your daughter has been freeloading in our house for months." My daughter lowered her head. She didn't defend herself, and that told me this wasn't the first time. They had no idea I owned the company that employed them both. I slowly set down my fork and said, "Sweetheart, get your coat. You're not spending another night in this house." She froze. Then one phone rang, then another, and suddenly neither man was laughing anymore. "Thank you for choosing Dad Family Revenge today. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country? I want to hear from you." Please note, this story includes fictional elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the lessons inside are ones worth holding on to. My name is Warren Caldwell. I am 61 years old, and on the night everything changed. I was wearing a gray sweater I had owned for 11 years. I drove my old pickup truck to the Mercer House in Pasadena, California, with a homemade apple pie sitting on the passenger seat. No expensive watch on my wrist, no designer jacket across my shoulders. Just an old man, a worn sweater, and a pie that had taken me 2 hours to make from scratch. What nobody at that dinner table knew was that I was the founder and majority owner of Caldwell Industrial Services, the company that printed the paychecks of both my son-in-law, Travis Mercer, and his father, Richard Mercer, every single month. I had kept it that way on purpose. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard opened the front door before I even reached the porch steps. He looked at my truck, the way people look at something they feel sorry for, then dropped his eyes to the pie in my hands. "Warren," he said, stretching my name out like it cost him something to say it. "Glad you finally made it." I handed him the pie. He looked down at it with an expression somewhere between polite and dismissive. "Diane already picked up dessert from the bakery," he said, "but bring it in anyway." I followed him inside without a word. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, my chest tightened. Elise was standing at the sink, her back to me, both arms buried in soapy water up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled up in a rushed knot. There was a dark stain of tomato sauce across her left sleeve. Every counter around her was covered in pots, cutting boards, and serving dishes she had clearly been working on for hours. In the living room, Travis sat in the leather armchair closest to the television, a glass of bourbon balanced on his knee, laughing at something his father had just said. Diane was on the sofa, deep in conversation with a cousin who had driven up from San Diego. My daughter was the only person in that house doing any work. "Dad." Elise turned around when she heard my footsteps. Her face broke into a smile that reached her eyes for just a second before something quieter replaced it. I crossed the kitchen and pulled her into a hug dish, soap and all. "Did you make all of this yourself?" I asked, looking around at the spread. "Mostly," she said, pulling back and wiping her hands on a towel. "It's fine. I don't mind." She said it too quickly. The way people say things they have repeated to themselves so many times, the words have lost their meaning. I rolled up my sleeves and reached for the dish towel. "Dad, stop!" Elise said, her voice dropping. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," I told her. At the dinner table, the trouble started before the bread was passed. Travis leaned back in his chair with the loose confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he sat in. He looked at me across the table and smiled the kind of smile that has no warmth in it. "So, Warren," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "what exactly do you do with yourself all day?" Richard chuckled from the head of the table. "Good question." I set my fork down. "I manage some investments," I said. Travis snorted into his glass. "Investments." He said the word like it was a joke. That's what retired guys call it when they putter around and pretend to be busy. Richard laughed outright this time, raising his glass slightly in Travis's direction. My daughter's hand tightened around her fork. Her knuckles went white against the handle. She stared at her plate with the focused expression of someone trying very hard to be somewhere else. That look, that small, practiced disappearance hit me harder than anything Travis had said. Honestly, Warren. Travis continued, resting both elbows on the table. You're 61 years old. You're healthy. You've been sitting around for 4 years since Margaret passed. Don't you think it's time to get a real job? He paused, and then with a grin that made my jaw tighten, he added, Stop being a freeloader living off your daughter. The table went very still. Elise's fork clinked hard against her plate. Her shoulders drew up toward her ears, but she did not raise her eyes. She pressed her lips together, swallowed once, and kept her gaze fixed on the food in front of her. That was the moment I understood what had been happening in this house for the past 8 months. It was not the insult that told me. It was the fact that my daughter did not flinch. I looked at Travis calmly and said, How's everything going at Caldwell these days? He blinked. Something shifted behind his eyes, a small confusion, a flicker of unease he could not quite explain. Fine, he said carefully. Why? I picked up my fork and returned to my meal. 30 seconds later, Travis's phone buzzed against the table. Then Richard's phone lit up across from him. Then Travis's buzzed again. Travis frowned and flipped his phone over. I watched his eyes move across the screen. I watched the color leave his face the way water drains from a bathtub, slowly at first, then all at once. He looked up at me. On his screen was an internal company notification from Caldwell Industrial Services moving the audit process to the next phase. At the bottom of the document, under the approval signature, were 2 words that had just changed everything at that table. Warren Caldwell, founder and majority owner. Is this you? Travis said, his voice cracking at the edges. Yes, I said. 1 word. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward or spread my hands wide to make a point. I simply looked at Travis across the dinner table and said, yes, the way a man confirms something that has always been true. The dining room felt like all the air had been pulled out of it. Richard's bourbon glass stopped halfway to his lips. Diane pressed both palms flat against the tablecloth, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. A cousin at the far end of the table quietly set down her fork. Travis stared at me. His jaw worked like he was trying to form a sentence, but kept losing the words before they reached his mouth. Caldwell Industrial, he finally said. You own Caldwell Industrial. The controlling share, I confirmed. Yes. And that's... He stopped, started again. That is not possible. Why not? His face flushed a deep, ugly red. Because you drive a beat-up truck and you bring homemade pie to Thanksgiving dinner. I also built the company from 6 employees and a rented warehouse, I said. People contain more than what you choose to see, Travis. He shoved his chair back so hard it scraped against the hardwood floor. Richard finally set his glass down and I noticed his hand was trembling slightly against the stem. Travis pointed a finger across the table at me. You set this up. That audit notification, you timed it. You sat there and let us... He caught himself breathing hard through his nose. The audit began 2 weeks before tonight, I said. The notification went out on an automated schedule. I don't arrange corporate governance around dinner parties. Travis. Elise's voice came out thin and strained. Please. He spun toward her. Did you know about this? Did you know who your father was this whole time? Elise flinched like she had been struck. Her eyes filled instantly, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth to hold back whatever was rising in her throat. Of course not, she whispered. I knew Dad had assets. I never knew the details. He never told me. Travis clearly did not believe her. He grabbed his phone off the table and disappeared into the hallway. I stood up, folded my napkin, and placed it beside my plate. Richard looked up at me. Something had crumbled behind his eyes. That easy confidence he had carried all evening was gone, replaced by something that looked a great deal like fear. Warren, he started. Let's be reasonable here. I've been perfectly reasonable all evening, I said. I walked into the hallway. Travis was pacing near the front door, phone pressed to his ear, words coming out fast and low. When he saw me, he ended the call. He crossed the distance between us in 4 steps and stopped close enough that I could smell the bourbon on his breath. His voice dropped to something quiet and hard. You want to play games with my career, he said. Fine. I know things about Elise. Private things. Things that would damage her badly in a courtroom. You push this and I will use every single one of them. My heart hammered once hard against my ribs, but I kept my face still. Then try, I said. Travis searched my face for hesitation. He found none. His jaw tightened. He took 1 step back. I walked past him into the dining room, and without raising my voice, I looked at my daughter. Get your coat, sweetheart. Elise's head came up. Her eyes were red at the edges, her chin unsteady. She pushed her chair back and reached for her coat from the rack near the door. Travis moved fast. His hand closed around her wrist. Elise is not going anywhere, he said. I looked at his hand on my daughter's wrist. I looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Let go of her hand, I said. The room held its breath. Diane had risen halfway from her chair. Richard gripped the edge of the table. The cousin at the far end pressed herself back as if trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Travis held on for a moment longer. Then slowly his fingers opened. Elise pulled her arm against her chest and rubbed her wrist without seeming to realize she was doing it. We walked out of that house together. I did not look back. Outside, the November air hit cold and clean against my face. I opened the passenger door for Elise and walked around to my side. We pulled out of the driveway. The lights of the Mercer house shrank in my rearview mirror. Elise sat with her hands pressed together in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Her breath came in careful, measured pulls, like someone who had learned to cry quietly and was working hard not to now. 10 minutes passed without a word between us. Then she turned toward me and her voice broke open. Dad, she said. There's something I have to tell you. We sat at my kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea that neither of us touched. Elise had stopped crying by the time we pulled into my driveway, but the evidence was still written across her face. Swollen eyes, a raw pink stripe across each cheekbone, the occasional sharp inhale that meant more tears were waiting just below the surface. On the wall above the stove hung a photograph of Margaret. It had been there for 22 years. Margaret was laughing in it, caught mid-sentence at somebody's birthday party, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. I had always loved that photo because she had no idea the camera was pointed at her. Elise followed my eyes to it and looked away quickly. Tell me, I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug and stared into it. Right after we got married. She began, her voice coming out unsteady. Travis brought home a document. He said it was an investment agreement, a way to pool our finances so we could grow our savings together faster. She paused, swallowed. I signed it, Dad. I didn't read the whole thing. I trusted him. What was it actually? Her fingers tightened around the mug until her knuckles went pale. A transmutation agreement. It converted my separate property into community property. Every dollar I had saved before the marriage, including the money you and Mom set aside for me when I turned 21. Her voice cracked on the last word. $43,000. The kitchen felt very quiet. He transferred it. She continued, her breath hitching. After I lost my job. Said he was moving it into an investment account. I asked him for statements. He said he was handling it. A tear slid down her cheek, and she pressed her fist hard against her mouth, furious at herself for crying. I never saw a single statement, Dad. The money is just gone. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it's coming back. I sat very still with my hands flat on the table. That $43,000 was not simply a number. Margaret had set it aside over years, birthday by birthday, Christmas by Christmas, quietly building something she intended to leave behind for our daughter. She had died before she could explain it to Elise herself. Travis had taken it, and he had used our daughter's trust to do it. I felt something move through my chest, not anger, not yet. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. Has he controlled every account since then? I asked. Elise nodded, her chin trembling. He keeps the debit cards. He approves every purchase. If I spend something he doesn't like, he brings up the house. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He always says the same thing. He says if I leave, I'll walk out with nothing. I believed him, Dad. For months, I actually believed him. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. They were ice cold. You are not walking out with nothing, I said. You never were. She broke, then really broke her shoulders, shaking a sob pushing out of her chest that she had clearly been holding back for a very long time. I kept my hands over hers and let her cry without trying to stop it or smooth it over. Some things need to move through a person before they can settle. When her breathing steadied, I stood up and picked up my phone. It was 11 o'clock at night, but Carol Simmons answered on the second ring. She had worked beside me for 20 years and understood that a late call from me was never accidental. I need two things, I told her. First, make sure that the audit team continues completely independently. Nobody interferes with the timeline or the scope. Second, pull every procurement record tied to Richard Mercer going back 5 years. All of it. By when? Carol asked. As soon as the team can manage it responsibly, I said. Don't rush the accuracy. Understood. A brief pause. Warren, are you all right? I looked at my daughter sitting at Margaret's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea, her eyes still wet. Not entirely, I said honestly. But I will be. I set the phone down and looked at Elise. First thing tomorrow morning, I told her, we're going to find you a place with a key that belongs only to you. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face. Dad. You are not going back to that house, I said. Not tonight. Not any night. For the first time since I had picked her up, something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. The faintest loosening of something that had been pulled tight for a very long time. Outside the kitchen window, Pasadena was dark and still. Margaret smiled from her photograph on the wall, caught forever mid-laugh, not knowing anyone was watching. I was up before sunrise. Old habit. 32 years of early mornings do not disappear just because you step away from a title. I brewed 1 cup of coffee, just one, the way I had done every morning since Margaret was no longer there to share the pot. and stood at the kitchen window while Pasadena came slowly back to life in the gray November dawn. Elise was asleep in the guest room down the hall. I had heard her moving around past midnight, the soft creak of the floorboards, the sound of water running briefly in the bathroom. I had not knocked. Some kinds of pain need the dark and the quiet to work themselves through. By 7:30, I had made a list of available rentals within a reasonable distance. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a safe neighborhood, a landlord who answered the phone. By 8, I had made 2 calls. By 9, Elise was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Her eyes still puffy, but her jaw set with something that had not been there the night before. "I found a place I want you to see," I said. She looked at me carefully. "Dad, I don't have—" "I know what you have," I said. "Let me finish." I set my mug down. "I will cover the deposit and the first 3 months of rent. After that, you pay on your own." Elise opened her mouth. "I am not rescuing you from Travis to make you dependent on me," I said. "That is not a trade I'm willing to make. After 3 months, the rent is yours to handle. If that means picking up extra shifts, you pick up extra shifts." "Understood." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded. "Understood." The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a cream-colored building on a quiet street in Pasadena. The kind of street with old trees whose roots had started lifting the sidewalk in places. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen with a window that faced east, and a living room just large enough to matter. It was not impressive. It was clean and solid, and entirely separate from anything that had happened in the last 8 months of my daughter's life. That was exactly what I was looking for. The landlord met us at the front entrance. Her name was Patricia Okafor, 68 years old, a wide woman with close-cropped silver hair and the deliberate posture of someone who had decided long ago not to shrink for anyone. She shook my hand first, then Elise's, then looked between us with sharp, assessing eyes. "Is this your daughter?" she asked me. "Yes," I said. Patricia studied Elise for a moment, with the quiet attention of someone reading a page. "She has your eyes," she said simply, and turned to unlock the front door without further explanation. She showed us the apartment efficiently, and without theater, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the closet space, the heating unit in the hall. When Elise ran her hand along the kitchen windowsill and looked out at the street below, something in her shoulders dropped half an inch. It was barely visible. I noticed it anyway. In Patricia's small ground-floor office, Elise picked up the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, just enough that I caught it, though I said nothing. She pressed the pen to the signature line and signed her name in careful, deliberate letters, like someone making a decision they intended to keep. Patricia slid a key across the desk, without ceremony. Elise picked it up. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment, this small, ordinary thing, and I watched her throat move as she swallowed hard against whatever was rising up inside her. "Thank you," she said to Patricia. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. Patricia nodded once. "Rent is due the 1st of each month," she said. "I don't send reminders." As we walked back down the stairwell, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. Travis Mercer calling. I looked at his name on the screen. I pressed the side button and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Elise had not seen it. She was walking just ahead of me down the stairs, one hand trailing along the wall, her new key pressed into her fist. I watched my daughter's back and thought about all the mornings she had woken up in a house where nothing belonged to her. That was over now. 3 days after Thanksgiving, someone knocked on my front door at 8 in the morning. I was in the workshop behind the house, sanding the edge of a cabinet door I had been building for the past 2 weeks. I heard the knock through the open window, 3 sharp raps. the kind that are trying to sound confident, but land a little too hard. I set the sandpaper down, wiped my hands on a cloth, and walked around to the front of the house. Travis was standing on my porch. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which was likely accurate. The sharp collar and pressed jacket from Thanksgiving were gone. He wore a rumpled gray coat over a shirt that had been buttoned one hole off. There were shadows under his eyes dark enough to look permanent, and the easy arrogance that had filled every room he entered on Thursday night had drained out of him completely. I did not open the screen door. "Warren," he said, "we need to talk." "You're talking," I said. He shifted his weight, ran a hand back through his hair. Thursday night got out of hand. I'd had too much to drink and I said things I shouldn't have said. He met my eyes briefly, then looked at a point just past my shoulder. "I owe you an apology." "You said what you believed," I said. "Alcohol doesn't install new opinions. It just removes the filter." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be the bigger person here." "I know you are," I said. "Keep going." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Look, we're family. Whatever is happening at Caldwell, whatever this audit is about, we can handle it the right way. Internally, between people who have a relationship." He stepped closer to the screen door, lowering his voice. "You have the ability to make one call and put the brakes on all of this. That's all I'm asking." I looked at him for a long moment, at the shadows under his eyes and the crooked buttons and the hands that couldn't quite stay still at his sides. "If I didn't own Caldwell Industrial," I said, "would you be standing on my porch right now?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Travis opened his mouth, closed it. His hands curled at his sides and released. He did not answer. That was answer enough. "Have a safe drive home, Travis," I said. I went back to the workshop. I picked up the sandpaper and returned to the cabinet door. The wood was a clean, pale oak, smooth in some places, and rough in others, the kind of work that required patience and told you immediately when you were forcing something that wasn't ready. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Carol, I have something preliminary on the procurement records," she said. "You're going to want to hear this." "Go ahead." "No. There's a vendor called Mercer Supply Co. We've flagged it across multiple contracts going back at least 2 years, possibly further. They've been selected as the preferred supplier in over 20 consecutive contracts." She paused. "Warren, the pricing doesn't add up. Their quotes run consistently higher than competing bids, sometimes significantly. And the name on the business registration has a connection to the Mercer family. We need more time to confirm the full picture. But what we're seeing is not accidental." I set the sandpaper down again. 20 contracts, preferred supplier. Pricing that didn't add up. A business registration tied to the Mercer name. Richard had been inside my company for 12 years. 12 years of handshakes and performance reviews and Christmas parties and people trusting him because he had been there long enough to seem like furniture. And the entire time something else had apparently been happening underneath it. "How long to confirm the full scope?" I asked. "The team is estimating 2 to 3 more weeks for a complete picture," Carol said. We don't want to move on numbers we can't fully defend." "Good. Don't rush it." I picked up a clean cloth and pressed it slowly against the surface of the wood. "What else?" A brief pause. "Someone inside the building has been asking questions about the audit timeline, Warren. Someone outside the team who shouldn't have any knowledge of the scope yet. We're tracking down the source, but I wanted you to know." I held the cloth still against the wood. Someone who shouldn't know. Someone who had heard something and was already moving. "Keep tracking," I said. "And Carol, thank you." I set the phone face down on the workbench and stood in the workshop while the morning light came through the window and lay itself across the pale oak in long, even strips. The wood waited patiently for me to come back to it. I was not ready yet. Bad news rarely arrives alone. In my experience, it travels in groups, patient, unhurried waiting until you have just enough stability to stand before it knocks you sideways again. The Monday after Thanksgiving taught me that lesson one more time. Carol called at 8:15 in the morning while I was eating breakfast. "We identified the source," she said, skipping any greeting. 20 years of working together had made pleasantries unnecessary between us. "The person asking about the audit timeline is a junior analyst in the operations division. Name is Kevin Doyle. He accessed a shared internal folder last Wednesday night outside of normal working hours and pulled screenshots of the preliminary audit framework. Then he sent them through an encrypted messaging application to a number we've traced back to Travis." I set my fork down. "Kevin Doyle," I said. "How long has he been with the company?" 4 years. "Clean record up until now." Carol's voice was careful and precise. "Warren, this is no longer just an internal policy matter. Unauthorized access to protected corporate systems is a violation of California Penal Code Section 502. The IT team has preserved the access logs as evidence. Legal is already involved." I understood what that meant. Travis had not panicked and made a careless mistake. He had reached into the company, found someone he could pressure, and used that person as a tool. Kevin Doyle had once asked Travis to overlook a minor reporting error. Travis had kept that information and saved it for exactly this kind of moment. That was not desperation. That was calculation. "Make sure Kevin Doyle has access to proper counsel," I said. "He was used. That doesn't eliminate his responsibility, but it matters." "Understood," Carol said. I ended the call and sat for a moment in the kitchen that had been quiet for 4 years. Then my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel Ross. I had known Daniel for 11 years. He was the attorney who had handled Margaret's estate after she passed, and had since become the closest thing I had to a general counsel for personal matters. A compact, plain-spoken man who operated out of a small office in Old Pasadena and had the habit of delivering difficult information without ornamentation of any kind. "Travis filed a divorce petition this morning," he said. "He's citing abandonment of the marital home." The words hit me like cold water. "Abandonment," I repeated. "It's a calculated move," Daniel said, and I could hear him turning pages on his desk. "California is a community property state. By filing first and framing a lease as the party who left, he's trying to establish a narrative before she can build one of her own. It's not a strong argument given the circumstances, but it creates paperwork she now has to respond to. What does she need to do? She needs to file a response. And she needs documentation, bank statements, any records of financial control, anything in writing." He paused. "Warren, if what you've described about the $43,000 is accurate, we're looking at a breach of fiduciary duty between spouses under California Family Code Section 721. That is significant. But I need evidence, not testimony." I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. 3 moves in one day. Richard quietly destabilizing the company from the inside by planting doubt with a minority shareholder. Travis using a junior employee to access protected systems. Travis filing a divorce petition designed to put Elise on the defensive before she had even found her footing. They were not falling apart. They were fighting back with everything they had. I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear and not anger, but a cold, clear-headed recognition of what I was actually dealing with. "Daniel," I said, I want to meet in your office. This week. Tomorrow morning work. Tomorrow morning works. I ended the call and stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the backyard. The workshop door was still open from the morning. The workbench was clear now, the cabinet finished and delivered weeks ago. The space felt different without a project in it. I picked up the phone one more time and called Carol back. Richard approached a minority shareholder. She confirmed before I could ask, Thomas Waverly. He told Waverly the audit was cover for a plan to push out long-term employees before a sale. Waverly called our investor relations office this afternoon asking questions. Travis must have told him. The timing was too clean for it to be anything else. 3 moves. 3 separate pressure points, all activated within hours of each other. I gripped the phone tighter than necessary. How do we protect Elise first? A pause on the other end. That, she said quietly, might be a question for Daniel Ross. Daniel Ross's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. It was a small space on the 2nd floor of a building on Colorado Boulevard in Old Pasadena, one window facing the street. 2 chairs across from a desk that had seen better decades. A bookshelf so full that several volumes had been stacked horizontally on top of the upright ones just to make them fit. There were no framed diplomas on the walls, no motivational prints, just books files, and a man who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped needing decoration to feel legitimate. Daniel was already behind his desk when I arrived, a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen behind his ear. Sit down, he said the way people say it when they mean business rather than hospitality. I sat. He flipped the legal pad to a fresh page. Walk me through everything from the beginning. I want to hear it from you directly, not through Carol's summary. I walked him through it. The Thanksgiving dinner. Travis's threat in the hallway. The $43,000. The transmutation agreement Elise had signed without understanding what it was. The financial control that had followed the cards. The approvals, the isolation. The divorce petition filed 3 days ago. Daniel wrote steadily while I talked, his pen moving without pause, his expression giving away nothing. When I finished, he set the pen down and looked at me. So the transmutation agreement is the key, he said. In California, a transmutation converting separate property into community property requires a written agreement that explicitly states the change in character of the asset. The spouse signing it must demonstrate informed consent. He tapped the legal pad. If Elise signed a document she believed was an investment agreement, and the language did not clearly identify it as a transmutation, that agreement may be voidable. We need to see the original document. And how do we get it? Wait, Elise requests it through the discovery process once she files her response to the divorce petition. He picked up his pen again. The $43,000 itself, if Travis transferred those funds from a joint account to a personal account without Elise's informed consent, that is a breach of fiduciary duty under California Family Code Section 721. Spouses in California are held to the highest duty of good faith in financial dealings with each other. What you're describing is not carelessness. It is a deliberate violation of that duty. Can it be recovered? We can petition for reimbursement as part of the divorce proceedings. Whether we recover all of it depends on where the money went. He paused, weighing something. Warren, you mentioned Travis said he used it for investment purposes. If the money has genuinely been spent or lost, recovery becomes more complicated. We pursue it regardless, but I want you to have accurate expectations. I nodded. What about the divorce petition itself? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Abandonment is a weak argument when we can demonstrate financial abuse and control. A spouse who leaves a situation involving documented financial coercion is not abandoning a marriage, she is protecting herself. He folded his hands on the desk. What I need from Elise is documentation. Bank statements going back at least 2 years. Any written communication where Travis references controlling the finances. Any record of the restricted access to accounts. She's gathering that now. Good. He looked at me directly. I'll be honest with you. Travis's attorney will come after you personally. They will argue you used your position at Caldwell to harm Travis in retaliation for a private family dispute. That argument fails the moment we demonstrate the audit predates Thanksgiving by 2 weeks. But they will make it loudly, and they will make it more than once. I met his eyes. I've dealt with louder. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough. I believe you. He reached for his phone and checked the time. One more thing. Elise needs to retrieve her personal belongings from the Mercer house before Travis has an opportunity to restrict access or change the locks. He set the phone back down. I can arrange a civil standby. A uniformed officer accompanies her to ensure both parties' safety during the retrieval. It's a standard procedure in domestic disputes in California. It protects Elise legally and creates an official record of what was taken, when, as soon as possible. He was already writing. This week, if she's ready. I stood and buttoned my jacket. She'll be ready, I said. Daniel walked me to the door. At the threshold, he stopped, one hand on the frame. Warren, he said, the strongest cases are never the loudest ones. He held my gaze for a moment. They're the ones with paperwork. I took the stairs down to the street and stepped out into the cold December air of old Pasadena, my breath visible in small white clouds ahead of me. I pulled out my phone and called Elise. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with the particular tension of someone who had been waiting. We need to go get your things, I told her. This week, before he thinks to change the locks. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then, okay, she said. Okay, Dad. I'll be ready. Before I reveal the secret that had been locked behind a pattern only Elise's birthday could open, comment Warren below. So I know this story is finding the right people. A small note before we continue this story includes fictional elements crafted to carry a meaningful message. If this is not the content for you, you are welcome to step away, no hard feelings at all. The civil standby was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Daniel had explained the process clearly the day before. A uniformed officer from the Pasadena Police Department would accompany Elise to the Mercer house and remain present throughout the retrieval. His presence was not an arrest, not an accusation. It was a legal safeguard. A way of ensuring that both parties were protected and that everything removed from the property was documented on the official record. It was standard procedure in California domestic disputes, used precisely because situations like this one had a history of going sideways without a neutral presence in the room. Travis was at work. Daniel had timed it deliberately. I drove Elise to the house but waited at the curb. Daniel had advised me not to enter. My presence could complicate the legal neutrality of the retrieval. I sat in the truck with the engine off and watched my daughter walk up the front path between Daniel and the officer, her shoulders pulled back in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has decided how they are going to hold themselves before they get to the door. Diane answered the bell. I could not hear what was said from the street, but I watched Diane step back and let them in, and I watched her face in the moment before the door closed, something moving through it that I could not name from that distance. Not anger. Something older and heavier than anger. Inside, from what Elise told me later, Diane had walked ahead of them through the house without speaking, leading them from room to room with the stiff, careful movements of a woman who was trying very hard to hold something together and not entirely succeeding. Elise worked through her list methodically. Clothing, documents, a box of photographs. The small ceramic lamp her mother had given her as a wedding gift that had somehow ended up in the guest bedroom. She moved through the house she had lived in for 8 months, as though cataloging a place she had never truly belonged to, which Daniel would later point out in his notes, was essentially accurate. In the master bedroom, she opened her laptop and handed it to Daniel. The login history was still there. Travis had not cleared it. Across a period of 11 months, his device had accessed her personal banking application 47 times, dates, timestamps, and IP addresses preserved in the browser's memory like a neat, damning ledger. Daniel photographed every screen without comment, his face professionally blank. Then Elise opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand on her side of the bed. She almost missed it. The drawer was mostly empty, a phone charger, a notepad, 2 pens. But tucked beneath the notepad flat against the wooden base was a phone she did not recognize. She picked it up, the screen lit at her touch, asking for a pattern unlock. Her hand hovered over it for a moment. Travis had always used her birthday for things he considered private. The safe combination, the storage unit padlock, the alarm code he'd never bothered to change. She had thought once that it meant something. Then, almost without thinking, she traced the shape of her own birthday month, day, year across the dots. The phone opened. She told me later that her first reaction was not anger. It was something colder than anger, a physical sensation, like the floor dropping 2 inches beneath her feet without warning. The messages on that phone went back 14 months. The contact was saved simply as R. The tone throughout was practical and unhurried, the way people write when they are discussing logistics, rather than anything they consider wrong. One exchange 3 months after Elise had lost her job read, "She's going to start looking for work again. That's a problem. Travis, I'll handle it. I'll tell her the timing isn't right, that we need her available in case the housing situation changes. Good. Keep her close. Keep her uncertain." And then further down a message that made Elise's chest seize, keep her dependent. If she has nowhere to go, she has nothing to say. She was still holding the phone when Daniel stepped into the doorway. He looked at her face first, then at the phone in her hand. He crossed the room and took it from her, gently examined it briefly, and placed it into an evidence bag he produced from his jacket, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen this before. "Good," he said. One word. Steady and without drama. Elise pressed her hand flat against her sternum, pushing back against whatever was trying to collapse inside her chest. Her eyes burned and her throat ached, but she did not cry. Not there, not in that room, not in that house. She picked up her box and walked out. In the hallway, Diane was standing near the staircase. When Elise passed, Diane reached out and touched her arm just briefly, just fingertips. "I didn't know about the phone," Diane said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wet at the corners. Elise looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment. Her jaw tightened. Then she shifted her box to her other hip and walked to the front door without answering. Some things she told me later did not deserve an answer yet. She called at 9 o'clock that evening. I was in the workshop running a hand plane across a piece of oak that did not need any more attention. It was the kind of work I did when I needed something to do with my hands while my mind worked through something else entirely. The phone was on the corner of the workbench, face up. When it lit with Diane Mercer's name, I stood still for a moment before picking it up. Warren. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. stripped of the social polish she wore at dinner parties and family gatherings down to something raw and uncertain underneath. "Diane," I said. "I tried to call Elise twice this week." She paused. "She didn't pick up." "She's not ready," I said, a long breath on the other end of the line. "I understand." Another pause, longer this time. "I need to say something to someone, and Richard can't be the one to hear it, and Travis certainly can't." Her voice caught on his name. "I don't know who else to call." I set the handplane down and leaned against the workbench. "Go ahead." I knew. The words came out thin and strained, like something she had been pressing down for a long time had finally pushed past the barrier. "Not about the phone. Not about the money. But I knew Travis spoke to Elise in ways that were not right. I watched it happen at my own dinner table, in my own living room, in my own kitchen." Her breath hitched sharply. "She cooked for us, Warren. Every Sunday for months she would come over and spend hours in that kitchen, and Travis would sit in the other room, and never once, not once, did he come in and ask if she needed help." I did not speak. I let her continue. "He talked about her like she was a problem he was managing." Diane's voice cracked down the middle. "He would say things like, 'She brings nothing to this family.' He said it in front of me. Multiple times." A sound escaped her that was halfway between a breath and a sob. And I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just the way he talked, just stress, just the adjustment of living together. I told myself so many things. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I let it happen. I am her mother-in-law, and I let it happen, and I am so ashamed of myself I can barely stand it." Her crying was quiet and controlled, the kind that belongs to people who have spent a lifetime keeping their emotions from spilling into rooms where they were not welcome. I let her finish before I spoke. "Diane," I said, "why are you calling me and not her?" "Because I don't deserve to call her yet." Her voice steadied slightly. "I wanted someone to know. Someone who loves her the way I should have protected her." I felt something move through my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to understanding. "You said yet," I told her. "Hold on to that word. When Elise is ready, she'll need to hear this from you directly. Not from me, not through anyone else." I straightened up from the workbench. "Can you do that?" "Yes." The word was immediate and firm, the first unambiguous thing she had said all call. "Yes, whenever she's ready." "Then that's something," I said. She asked before she hung up whether Richard was going to lose everything. Her voice on that question was different again, smaller, the voice of a woman asking about her husband of 35 years, not about a man who had made wrong choices inside a company. I was honest with her. "If the investigation finds what it appears to be finding," I said, "there will be consequences. I can't tell you what they will look like. I don't control the outcome, and I wouldn't change it even if I did." A silence on the line that was not empty, but full of everything she could not bring herself to say. "I understand," she said finally. "Good night, Warren." "Good night, Diane." I set the phone back on the corner of the workbench and stood in the workshop for a long time after the call ended. The wood waited on the bench beside me, patient and indifferent. I thought about Margaret. If she had been standing where Diane had been standing, watching something wrong happen to someone she was supposed to protect, she would have said something. Immediately, and without calculating the cost. She would have called sooner, I thought. I turned off the workshop light and walked back to the house through the cold December dark. The deposition room was exactly the kind of space designed to make you feel like you were already losing. A long, rectangular table. Chairs that were technically comfortable but positioned to remind you which side of the table you were on. A window with half-closed blinds that cut the winter light into thin institutional strips. A court reporter in the corner with her fingers resting on her machine, ready to capture every word anyone said and hold it permanently against them. Gregory Fallon was already seated when Daniel and I arrived. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of practiced ease that men develop after spending decades in rooms like this one. He was a civil litigation attorney, the kind Travis had hired specifically because he knew how to make personal motivations look like professional misconduct. He wore a dark suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who believed preparation was for other people. He looked up when we entered, smiled briefly at Daniel, and looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved in his head. Daniel pulled out his chair without acknowledging the smile. We sat. The deposition began with standard questions: my name, my role at Caldwell Industrial, the length of my tenure, the structure of my ownership. Fallon's tone was pleasant and unhurried, the way a person sounds when they are leading you somewhere and want you to enjoy the walk until you realize where you have arrived. 40 minutes in, he leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "your wife Margaret passed away approximately 4 years ago. Is that correct?" My jaw tightened by 1 degree. "That's correct." "And following her death, you stepped back from active management of Caldwell Industrial." "I transitioned operational responsibilities to the executive team, yes." "You've described yourself as living," he glanced at a page, quietly, "alone. Minimal social engagement. Would that be a fair characterization?" Daniel's pen stopped moving. "Relevance," he said flatly. "It goes to state of mind during the period in question," Fallon said without looking at him. "Answer if you're comfortable," Daniel told me. "I live simply," I said. "That has nothing to do with state of mind." Fallon nodded slowly as though I had confirmed something he already suspected. He shuffled to the different section of his folder. "I want to be transparent with you, Mr. Caldwell. We have filed a separate motion in the civil proceedings related to Caldwell Industrial. In that motion, we present the position that the decision to initiate this audit, occurring in close proximity to a significant personal conflict involving your son-in-law, may reflect impaired judgment resulting from unresolved grief following your wife's passing." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Grief-induced impairment. They had taken Margaret and turned her into a legal argument. Something moved through my chest that I had no clean name for. It was not anger, and it was not grief. It was something older and harder, the feeling of watching something sacred being handled carelessly by people who did not understand what they were touching. I looked at Fallon directly. I kept my face exactly as it was. "Entering. The audit was initiated by the executive team," I said, following a flagged anomaly in our procurement data. "The initiation was documented and approved 14 days before Thanksgiving. My signature does not appear on that document because the process is designed to operate independently of ownership." I paused 1 beat. "I don't schedule corporate governance around personal events. I designed the system specifically so that I wouldn't have to." This court reporter's fingers moved steadily. Fallon held my gaze for a moment, then made a small note on his legal pad. Later that afternoon, Carol called to tell me the motion had been reviewed and rejected. The independent audit record signed by the executive team, time-stamped 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, bearing no trace of my involvement in the initiation, had made Fallon's argument impossible to sustain. The judge had dismissed it without extended consideration. I received the news standing in the parking lot outside the building, my breath making small clouds in the cold December air. I did not feel relief exactly. What I felt was something more like exhaustion, the specific tiredness that comes not from physical effort, but from sitting in a room and listening to someone use the name of someone you loved as a tool. Daniel appeared beside me, buttoning his coat against the wind. "They'll try something else," he said matter-of-factly. "I know," I said. He glanced at me sidelong. "You held up well in there." I looked out across the parking lot. Somewhere across the city, Elise was in her apartment on the 3rd floor with her key on the kitchen counter and her name on a lease. "I've held up through worse," I said. Fallon passed us on his way to his car. He paused long enough to say quietly, and without looking directly at either of us, "This isn't over, Caldwell." I watched him walk away. "It never is." I said to no one in particular. The email arrived at 6:15 in the morning on the 2nd Monday of January. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had just finished brewing, watching the winter light come through the window above the sink in long, pale strips. The phone buzzed once against the countertop. I picked it up, saw Carol's name in the sender line, and set my coffee down. The subject line read, "Final Audit Report, Caldwell Industrial Services for Review." I opened it. The document was 41 pages long. I did not read it the way a person reads a novel beginning to end, absorbing each section in sequence. I read it the way I had learned to read financial documents over 30 years of running a company: executive summary, first findings, second supporting data, third. The picture assembled itself in my mind with the quiet, irrefutable clarity of arithmetic. Richard Mercer had been the primary architect. Over a period of 4 years, he had steered 23 procurement contracts toward a vendor called Mercer Supply Co., a business registered in the name of his brother-in-law, a man who had no prior experience in industrial supply, and whose company had been incorporated 8 months after Richard joined Caldwell's procurement division. The pricing on those contracts ran between 14% and 22% above competitive market rates. The total financial impact to Caldwell Industrial, $2,140,000. The violations fell under California Penal Code, Section 641.3, commercial bribery, which applies when an employee receives undisclosed benefits from a third party in exchange for favorable treatment in business decisions. The threshold for felony classification under that statute is $2,500. Richard had exceeded it by a considerable margin. Travis appeared in the supporting documentation under a separate heading. He had not initiated the arrangement, but internal communications recovered from the company server showed that he had become aware of it approximately 18 months into its operation and had chosen not to report it. For a manager operating in a fiduciary capacity, that choice constituted a breach of duty to the company. Combined with his role in the unauthorized system access involving Kevin Doyle, his exposure was significant. Both had been formally terminated. The file had been forwarded to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for review. Thomas Waverly, the minority shareholder Richard had approached in December, had been briefed directly by Caldwell's investor relations team 2 weeks earlier. His questions had been answered. He had not raised them again. I set the phone down on the counter. I picked up my coffee. It had gone slightly cool while I was reading. I drank it anyway, standing at the window, looking out at the backyard where the workshop door was still closed from the night before. I waited to feel something: satisfaction, perhaps, or the particular relief that arrives when something you have been holding in tension finally resolves. Neither came. What settled in instead was something quieter and less dramatic: a recognition that the process had worked exactly as it was supposed to work, without my hand on any of the moving parts after the first night. I had asked Carol to keep the audit independent. She had. I had asked the team not to rush accuracy for speed. They had not. The result was a document that 41 pages of evidence could defend from any angle Fallon or anyone else chose to attack it from. I rinsed my coffee cup and walked out to the workshop. The cabinet I had been building for the past 3 weeks was nearly finished. I ran my hand along the top edge, smooth now the grain of the oak visible in the morning light coming through the single window. I picked up a piece of fine grit sandpaper and began working on the last rough corner near the base. Carol called at 9. "Have you read through it?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you want to put out a formal statement? The executive team is ready to draft one." I thought about it for a moment. A statement would be accurate. It would also be loud, and loudness had never been the way I preferred to operate. "The numbers speak for themselves," I said. "Let the legal process do its job. The team handled this with integrity. That's what matters." "Understood." A pause. "Warren, are you all right?" I looked at the cabinet in front of me, at the work that was almost done. "I'll be better when Elise is," I said honestly. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the workbench. 20 minutes later, it buzzed again. I turned it over. Travis Mercer calling. I watched his name pulse on the screen through 4 full rings, then 5. Then the call dropped to voicemail, and the screen went dark. I placed the phone back on the workbench and returned to the sandpaper. The last rough corner near the base took patience. The grain ran in 2 directions there and forced you to slow down or risk tearing the surface. I slowed down. I heard him before I saw him. Heavy footsteps on the gravel path that ran along the side of the house, not the careful, measured steps of someone who had been invited, but the kind that land hard and fast and announce themselves like an argument that has already started. I set down the cabinet door I had been fitting and straightened up from the workbench just as Travis Mercer came through the open workshop door. He looked like a man who had been burning from the inside for days and had finally run out of anything left to burn. His eyes were red at the rims, his jaw unshaved, his coat hanging open despite the January cold, as though he had forgotten to button it or stopped caring somewhere between his car and my workshop. His hands were shaking, not the fine, barely visible tremor of nerves, but the coarser shaking of someone whose body had absorbed more than it could quietly contain. "You destroyed my life," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "You sat at that dinner table and you smiled and you let us talk and you had all of this planned the entire time." I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. "The audit began 14 days before Thanksgiving," I said. "I've said that in a sworn deposition. It's in the record. Don't." He stepped forward, his chest heaving. "Don't give me the corporate answer. You knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing." I looked at him steadily. "I know what I didn't do. I didn't call off an investigation because my son-in-law was in the way of it. I didn't protect someone from consequences they had earned." I paused. "I didn't take money that belonged to my daughter and use it to pay off debts I'd been hiding since before the wedding." Something shifted in his face. It was not the shift of a man who had been caught. It was the shift of a man who had just realized he had walked into a room he could not walk back out of. His mouth opened. His jaw worked. The shaking in his hands moved up through his arms and into his shoulders. "The IT team has the access logs, Travis," I said quietly. "They know you contacted Kevin Doyle. They know when. They know what he sent you and through which application." I took one step toward him. "So before you finish the sentence, you came here to say, understand that I already know more than you think I do." His face crumpled. Not with remorse, with the particular devastation of a man whose plan has failed completely and who has nothing left to fall back on. I was trying to protect my father, he said, his voice dropping to something ragged and low. I knew about the audit before Thanksgiving. I told him. I thought if he knew early enough, he could. He stopped, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. I thought I could give him enough time to fix it. He had leaked the information himself. He had handed his father a warning, and in doing so, had handed the investigators proof that he had known about the procurement violations long before the audit surfaced them. He had tried to save Richard and buried them both. I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since the night Elise sat at my kitchen table with ice-cold hands and told me what had happened to the money her mother had set aside for her. Where is the $43,000, Travis? The workshop went very still. He could not look at me. His eyes dropped to the floor, to the wood shavings scattered across the concrete, to anywhere that was not my face. Whatever his attorney had told him to say or not say, it was clear he had stopped caring about any of it the moment he walked through my door. His shoulders curved inward. The shaking in his hands worsened. I had debts, he said finally. The words came out like something he had been pressing underwater for a long time and could no longer hold down. Before Elise and I got married, online gambling. I owed people. It wasn't a small amount, and it wasn't the kind of debt you can just carry. He exhaled in a long, unsteady rush. I used it to clear the balance. All of it. There's nothing left. I can't give it back. The money Margaret had saved. Birthday by birthday. Christmas by Christmas. Set aside quietly for a daughter who never knew it existed until it was already gone. Something moved through my chest and lodged there, not anger, because anger would have been easier. This was older and heavier than anger. This was grief wearing a different face. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I intended, and it was not entirely steady. "Get off my property," I said. Travis flinched as though I had struck him. He stood there for a moment longer, shoulders caved, eyes wet, the shaking in his hands, visible even from where I stood, and then he turned and walked back out through the workshop door. I listened to his footsteps on the gravel. I listened until they faded and a car door opened and closed somewhere on the street, and an engine started and pulled away. I looked down at my hands. I was still holding a wood clamp I did not remember picking up. I set it down on the workbench very slowly, the way you set something down when you need the action to mean something. Outside, a winter bird called once from somewhere in the yard and went quiet. The 4th month's rent was due on a Tuesday. Elise had known the date was coming for 2 weeks. She had written it on a sticky note pressed to the corner of her bathroom mirror, not because she needed the reminder, but because she wanted to see it every morning. A date that belonged to her. A number she had earned herself. She told me this when she called that evening after she had made the transfer. "It went through," she said. Her voice carried something I had not heard in it for a long time. Not happiness, exactly, but the quieter, more durable thing that lives underneath happiness. Steadiness. The sound of someone who had found the floor beneath them and was learning to trust that it would hold. "Good," I said. "I picked up an extra shift last week," she continued, "at the Glendale location. The manager there, she's been letting me shadow her on inventory days, learning the system." A brief pause. "I think I'm actually getting good at it, Dad." I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, listening to my daughter talk about inventory systems and extra shifts, and a manager who had been patient enough to teach her something useful, and I felt something ease in my chest that had been tight since November. "Tell me about the apartment," I said. "It's good. It's quiet." She thought for a moment. The radiator makes a noise at night that took me about 2 weeks to stop noticing. Now I kind of like it. It means the heat is working. That was the kind of thing a person says when they have stopped waiting for something to go wrong. The rain started that evening. One of those long, slow California winter rains that arrive in March without urgency, settling into the streets and the gutters and the old trees with their lifted sidewalk roots, as though they intend to stay a while. Elise was in her apartment on the 3rd floor when she heard the knock. Patricia Okafor stood in the hallway with a covered pot balanced in both hands, steam rising from the edges of the lid. "Pepper soup," Patricia said, holding it out. "My mother's recipe. Good for cold nights." She looked past Elise into the apartment briefly, the way she looked at everything, assessing quiet, taking in more than she let on. "You look better than when you moved in." Elise stepped back to let her in, and Patricia set the pot on the kitchen counter and pulled 2 bowls from the cabinet, as though she had been doing it for years. They sat at the small kitchen table while the rain moved across the window in sheets, and Patricia told her about the son she had raised alone in this building, after leaving a marriage that had taken more from her than she had understood she was giving at the time. He was 34 now, an engineer in Seattle, called every Sunday without being asked. "How did you know when you were ready?" Elise asked. To stop being afraid that it would happen again. Patricia wrapped both hands around her bowl and considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I stopped asking that question," she said finally. "Fear doesn't leave because you're ready. It leaves because you get too busy building something to keep feeding it." Elise looked at her across the small table, this woman who had handed her a key 3 months ago without ceremony or sentiment, who charged a fair rent and sent no reminders, and had just appeared at her door in the rain with her mother's recipe, and felt something shift behind her sternum. Not the dramatic, cracking open kind of shift. The quiet kind. The kind that means something has moved from one place to another and decided to stay. "I thank you," Elise said, "for the soup and for—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "For not asking questions when we moved in." Patricia picked up her spoon. "You had your father's eyes," she said simply. That was enough. Later that night, after Patricia had gone back downstairs and the rain had settled into a steady murmur against the glass, Elise's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from Daniel Ross. She picked it up and read it once. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the wet street below, where the old tree's roots had lifted the sidewalk in 3 places, and breathed. The hearing was scheduled. Los Angeles Superior Court smelled like floor wax and old paper, and the particular staleness of air that has been recycled through government buildings for decades. I had been inside courtrooms before contract disputes, a zoning issue 20 years ago, when we were expanding the company's 2nd facility. The proceedings after Margaret's estate was filed. I knew the specific quality of silence that lived in these rooms, the way it pressed down on everything and made even ordinary sounds, a cough, a chair scraping a folder being opened, carry more weight than they deserved. We arrived early. Daniel had insisted on it. He walked Elise through the hallway outside the courtroom one more time, his voice low and steady, going over what to expect from Fallon's approach, and how to sit and when to let him handle the talking. Elise listened with her arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, but the way a person holds themselves together when they are cold and cannot afford to be. Judge Patricia Howe entered the courtroom at 9:15. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular economy of the movement that belongs to people who have spent decades making decisions and have long since stopped performing the act of making them. She sat, arranged her papers, and looked at both tables with the level assessing attention of someone who had already read the file and was now reading the people. Fallon went first. He argued that Elise had voluntarily left the marital home, that her departure on the night of Thanksgiving constituted abandonment under California law, and should be weighed accordingly in the division of marital assets. He spoke confidently and at length, the way men do when they believe the sound of their own voice is persuasive on its own terms. Judge Howe let him finish without expression. Daniel stood. He submitted the bank records first, 11 months of restricted account access, Elise's debit card, held by Travis every significant purchase requiring his approval. He submitted the digital evidence, second 47 unauthorized logins to Elise's personal banking application from Travis's device dates and timestamps preserved in the browser history. He submitted the communications from the secondary phone, third entered into evidence through the civil standby record that included the attending officer's signature. He spoke for 14 minutes. He used no dramatic language. He presented each document in sequence, named its source, explained its relevance, and sat down. Fallon objected twice. Judge Howe overruled both objections without elaboration. She reviewed the submitted materials for several minutes, turning pages with the unhurried attention of someone who intended to get this right. Then she looked up. Temporary spousal support was granted 18 months in accordance with California Family Code, weighted to account for the documented period of financial control that had eliminated Elise's ability to maintain independent income. The division of remaining marital assets, such as they were, would proceed through standard community property guidelines. Travis's petition citing abandonment was dismissed. Elise's breath left her in a single quiet rush. Outside in the parking structure beneath the building, we sat in my truck for a long time without going anywhere. The concrete around us was gray and low-ceilinged and smelled of exhaust, and the sounds of the city came in muffled and distant, and none of that mattered because my daughter was sitting in the passenger seat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her shoulders shaking and tears running down her face in the particular way that has nothing to do with sadness. I let her cry for a while. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out a folded handkerchief, old cotton white, the edges worn soft from years of washing. Margaret had bought it for me at a small shop in Carmel on our 23rd anniversary. I had carried it in every jacket I owned since the day she gave it to me. I held it out to Elise. She looked at it. Her breath caught. "That's Mom's," she said. Her voice was barely a thread. She picked it out," I said. "Seemed right to let her be here for this one." Elise took it from my hand and pressed it against her face and cried in a way I had not heard from her since she was very small, fully and without restraint. The kind of crying that means something has finally finished rather than something has begun. I put the truck in drive but did not pull out yet. "What happens to Richard now?" she asked when her breathing had steadied enough to speak. I looked out through the windshield at the concrete wall in front of us. "That's not up to me anymore," I said. I pulled out of the parking structure and drove us north toward Pasadena into the afternoon light. I did not expect to see Richard Mercer standing beside my truck. It was a Tuesday morning in early November, cool and overcast the way Los Angeles mornings sometimes are before the marine layer burns off and the day fully becomes itself. The kind of morning that cannot decide whether it intends to be gray all day or whether it is simply taking its time. I had parked in the lot outside the building where Caldwell's legal team had scheduled a brief procedural meeting. Nothing significant, a signature on a document related to the restitution agreement that had been finalized the previous week. I had been inside for less than an hour. Richard was leaning against the passenger side of my pickup, with his hands deep in his coat pockets, looking at the ground. He was thinner than he had been at Thanksgiving. The confident set of his shoulders, that particular posture of a man who believed he took up exactly the right amount of space and was comfortable doing so, was gone. What remained looked like the outline of it, the shape without the weight inside. He looked up when he heard my footsteps cross the asphalt toward him. "Warren," he said. I stopped a few feet away and waited. He had accepted a plea agreement 3 weeks earlier. His attorney, a criminal defense lawyer from downtown Los Angeles, not the kind of man Richard could have afforded before 12 years of supplemented income from Mercer Supply Co., had quietly expanded his financial options, had negotiated the terms over a period of several months. The terms were not gentle. Richard would plead no contest to 1 count of commercial bribery under California Penal Code, Section 641.3. The statute that governs employees who receive undisclosed benefits from third parties in exchange for favorable treatment in business decisions. He would enter into a structured restitution agreement, committing to repay the full $2,140,000 to Caldwell Industrial over a period of 7 years. He would serve 5 years of formal probation, with quarterly check-ins and strict conditions on employment and travel. He would be permanently barred from holding any position involving financial oversight, procurement authority, or vendor relationships of any kind. He would not go to prison provided he met every condition of the agreement without deviation for the full duration. It was by any reasonable measure a significant consequence for a man who had spent 12 years inside a company, telling himself that the work was still getting done, and therefore nothing real was being harmed. During the months of negotiation, I had been informed by Caldwell's legal team that Diane had retained her own attorney entirely separate from Richard's criminal defense counsel and had formally requested access to the complete audit documentation before her husband signed anything. Her attorney had framed it carefully: due diligence, a spouse's right to understand the full scope of her family's legal and financial exposure before committing to a multi-year restitution obligation that would reshape their household finances for the better part of a decade. It was a legitimate request. We had complied without condition. What it told me was something I had been thinking about since the night Diane had called me in my workshop and told me she should have said something a long time ago. She was not simply standing beside her husband because that was what you did. She was standing beside him with her eyes fully open, understanding exactly what she was standing beside and choosing to remain there anyway. That was not naivety. That was a decision made by someone who had looked at the complete picture and decided what she could live with. That was a different thing entirely from not knowing. "I wanted to say something," Richard said. He was looking at the asphalt again, the way people look at the ground when they cannot find a place to put their eyes that feels appropriate to the weight of the conversation they are trying to have. "You're saying it," I said. He exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to release something he had been holding for longer than just this morning. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. The contracts were still being fulfilled. The work was still getting done on time and within the broader parameters. He pressed his lips together until they went pale at the edges. I told myself that for 4 years. Every time I approved another contract, every time the numbers came in, and I looked the other way, I told myself the same thing. "I know," I said. "I don't expect anything from you." He raised his eyes to mine briefly, just long enough for me to see that what was in them was not defiance and not a request. Only the particular exhaustion of a man who had run out of the energy required to pretend and then dropped them again. "I'm not standing here for that. I just—" He stopped. His jaw tightened and released. The words he had come with appeared to have run out before he had finished finding them. 12 years is a long time to work for someone without ever actually knowing who they are. The words arrived differently than I think he had intended, because he was right in a way that extended further than he understood. 12 years. And in all that time, Richard Mercer had looked at the man he privately called the retired guy and seen exactly what he expected to see: an aging widower in a worn sweater who drove an old truck and made no claims on anyone's attention. He had seen that picture and stopped looking. He had decided he already knew. That habit of stopping, of looking at a surface and concluding you had seen everything worth seeing, had made it easier to do what he did inside the company. The same habit passed along somehow to his son, had made it easier for Travis to look at Elise after she lost her job and decide she had nowhere left to go and nothing left that needed protecting. The careless, consequential habit of deciding you already know who someone is. That was the lesson that lived at the center of all of this. Not in the audit results or the legal proceedings or the Thanksgiving dinner that had broken open in ways none of them had anticipated, in the habit itself. "For what it's worth," Richard said. He stopped there. His jaw moved once. He could not find the rest of it. Whether it was an apology that would not fully form or something else entirely, I did not know. Some sentences begin with more intention than they can carry through to the end. I waited. He did not continue. "I know," I said. I opened the driver's side door and got in. Through the windshield, I watched Richard straighten up slowly from beside the truck, a careful, deliberate movement, the movement of a man for whom certain things that were once easy had become effortful. He buttoned his coat against the May marine layer. He walked across the parking lot toward a sedan I did not recognize, smaller and older than the car he had driven to Thanksgiving, and got in without looking back. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the cab. Outside, the marine layer was beginning to thin at the edges the way it does by late morning, the pale gray lightening in patches where the sun was working its way through. The day was deciding what it intended to be. I thought about what Richard had said. 12 years without knowing who someone is. I thought about how much of what had happened in the past 6 months had come from exactly that, from people who had looked and stopped looking, who had decided and stopped wondering, who had built an understanding of the people around them out of what was convenient to see rather than what was actually there. I thought about Elise in her apartment in Pasadena, 3 miles from here, at work, right now, at the Glendale location, with her name on a lease and a shift supervisor role, and a radiator that made a sound she had learned to find reassuring. I pulled out of the lot and drove home to Pasadena. The day was deciding what it intended to be. Kind of narrow storefront with buckets of cut flowers on the sidewalk that you notice without ever quite finding the occasion to go inside. I had gone in. A woman behind the counter looked up from something she was arranging. "Something specific?" she asked. I thought about the kitchen windowsill, the blue vase that had been standing empty for 4 years, the photograph above the stove. "Yellow roses," I said, "if you have them." She did. I put the yellow roses in the same blue vase Margaret had always used. It was on the kitchen windowsill, where she had kept it, where it had stood empty for 4 years, because I had never found a reason compelling enough to move it or fill it. The vase itself was nothing remarkable, a simple ceramic cylinder she had picked up at a market in Santa Barbara the summer before she got sick. The particular shade of blue that reminded her, she had said, of the color the ocean turns at dusk when the light is going, but has not entirely gone. She had placed it on the windowsill the same afternoon she brought it home, and it had lived there ever since through everything. I trimmed the stems the way she had shown me once, at an angle underwater so the cut would not seal itself before the flower could drink. I had watched her do it dozens of times across the years, without thinking I was learning anything, the way you absorb small competencies from people you love without ever registering the moment of transmission. Turns out I was learning the whole time. I filled the vase and placed the roses in and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the backyard where the workshop door was still closed and the last light of the November afternoon was going down behind the fence. The yellow of the roses caught the fading light and held it for a second before the room shifted into the quieter tones of early evening. I made dinner for one, pasta simple, the kind that requires enough attention to keep your hands occupied, but not enough imagination to demand anything of you beyond the immediate task. I ate at the kitchen table with the roses at the edge of my vision, and the photograph of Margaret above the stove, and the particular quiet of a house that has been lived in alone long enough that the silence has become familiar rather than heavy. After dinner, I washed up and went into the workshop. I was building a box. Not a large one, small enough to hold comfortably in both hands, the kind of dimensions that suggest something meant to be kept, rather than displayed. I had been working on it for several weeks, choosing the wood carefully from the stack of figured oak I had been saving in the back of the workshop for a project that felt worthy of it. I had cut the joints by hand, rather than with a router, because the slower method produced edges that fit together without gaps, and because, if I was honest with myself, I had wanted this particular piece of work to take time. The lid had a small brass hinge I had ordered from a specialty supplier in Vermont, whose catalog I had been reading for years without ever quite finding the right occasion for the good hardware. The interior I had lined with a piece of dark green felt cut from fabric Margaret had bought years ago for a sewing project she had never gotten around to finishing, still folded in the cedar chest in the bedroom. Still the same deep green it had been the day she brought it home. I had thought about that for a while before I used it, whether it was the right thing to do with something she had left behind. I had decided that it was. She would have agreed, I thought. She had always had a strong objection to good materials going to waste. I worked until 9 o'clock, fitting the hinge, checking the lid's movement, running a final piece of fine sandpaper along the exterior surfaces until the grain came through the way I wanted it to. Then I applied the first coat of oil and set the box carefully in the center of the workbench to dry overnight. I cleaned the bench, hung my tools in their places, and went inside. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and looked at the roses in the blue vase on the windowsill. Then I walked down the hall toward the bedroom. I do not know exactly what made me stop outside the door. I had walked past it 10,000 times in 4 years. The same door, the same hallway, the same particular quality of quiet that lived in that part of the house after Margaret was gone. I had gone through her things in the first year carefully, and without rushing, giving away what needed to go and keeping what I could not bring myself to release. I had cleared the surfaces of the room and washed the curtains and replaced the burned-out bulb in the lamp on her side of the bed. But the nightstand drawer I had opened only once very early on and had not opened since. I went in. The room smelled faintly of the hand lotion she had kept in the nightstand, nearly empty. Now the scent diminished to something you had to look for rather than something that met you at the door, but still there. The quilt she had chosen was still on the bed. The lamp she had bought at an antique fair in Monrovia was still on her side. Things arranged themselves in rooms and stayed where they were placed, even when the people who placed them were gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer. There was not much inside. A tube of hand lotion nearly empty. A bookmark with a small pressed flower sealed behind the laminate of violet. I thought, though, the color had faded enough over the years to be uncertain. A small notebook with her name written on the cover in her own hand that I had not opened 4 years ago, and did not open now because some things were not mine to read, regardless of how much time had passed. And beneath the notebook, flat against the wooden base of the drawer, a white envelope. On the front, in Margaret's handwriting, the particular forward slant of it, the slightly elongated loops on the letters L and H, the way she always left a small gap between the words, as though each one deserved its own space, was a single word. Elise. I held it for a long time without opening it. I had seen it 4 years ago when I first went through the drawer. I had left it then because it was addressed to our daughter, not to me. I had left it the same way I would leave a letter addressed to a neighbor sitting on the wrong doorstep, not out of indifference, but out of a simple and instinctive respect for the fact that it belonged to someone else. You did not open other people's letters, not even when the person who wrote them was gone. Not even when you loved both the writer and the recipient more than you had words for. But tonight felt different from those 4 years of walking past the door. Tonight, with the yellow roses in the blue vase on the kitchen windowsill and the small box sitting in the center of the workbench with its first coat of oil drying slowly in the November air tonight, with a year behind me that had cost more than I had anticipated and returned more than I had expected, I thought Margaret might understand. I opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded twice, written on both sides in the same careful hand as the name on the front. She must have written it near the end, when she still had the steadiness to be precise, but was already thinking clearly about what she would not be there to say. I had watched her during that period, writing things down more than usual, notes left in the kitchen, reminders on the calendar, small pieces of paper tucked into books she wanted me to find. She had always understood that the things you said while you were present could be forgotten, but the things you wrote down had a better chance of surviving you. She had written about love. Not the broad, declarative kind that announces itself in large gestures and expects to be recognized. The specific kind. The kind that shows up in small, repeated actions that accumulate over time into something that cannot be mistaken for anything else. She had written, "Find the one who stays in the kitchen to help you wash the dishes. Not because he has to. Not because you asked. Because he understands that the small things are not small." I read it twice. Then I folded the paper carefully along the original creases and held it in both hands and sat for a while on the edge of the bed in the room that still smelled faintly after all this time, like the lotion in the nearly empty tube in the drawer. My throat ached in a way that had nothing to do with illness. I did not cry. I had done my crying for Margaret in the first year in private and without witness, the way I preferred to do most things that cost me. What I felt now was something different, not grief exactly, but the particular tenderness that comes from being reminded without warning of how completely someone once knew you. How they had understood you well enough to write something down for someone else that you needed to read first. She had written it for Elise, but she had known, I think, that it would find its way to me before it found its way to her. I placed the letter carefully back in its envelope and slid it into the breast pocket of my shirt, close to where it needed to be. 2 weeks until Thanksgiving. The months between May and November had passed. The way quiet months do, gradually, without ceremony, without the kind of event that marks itself clearly in your memory as the moment things changed. Elise had her job at the Glendale location, her apartment with the radiator that made a sound she had learned to find reassuring her key on the counter that belonged only to her. I had my workshop and my mornings, and the particular satisfaction of work done without rushing. Life had not returned to what it was before any of this began. It had become something else instead. Something steadier and more honest, built from what had actually happened, rather than from what any of us had assumed. I turned off the bedroom light and walked back down the hall. The yellow roses were still on the kitchen windowsill in the blue vase, catching the last of the light from the hallway as I passed. I went to bed. She had been in my kitchen since 9 in the morning. I knew because I had heard her car pull into the driveway while I was still in the workshop finishing the last coat of oil on the wooden box. And by the time I came inside 40 minutes later, the kitchen smelled like butter and thyme and something sweet baking in the oven that turned out to be a cranberry bread she had found in a cookbook. Margaret had kept on the shelf above the refrigerator for 30 years. She had not asked permission to use that cookbook. She had simply reached up and taken it down the way a person reaches for something that belongs to them. That small gesture, the easy, unself-conscious confidence of it, told me more about where Elise had arrived in the past 12 months than anything she could have said out loud. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched her move between the counter and the stove with the particular ease of someone who was cooking because she wanted to. Not because a table needed to be set before guests arrived. Not because someone was keeping track of whether she was contributing enough. Because it was Thanksgiving, and she had decided she wanted to make cranberry bread and roast a chicken, and there was nobody in this house who was going to tell her otherwise. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and stayed out of her way. She hummed something low and tuneless while she worked, pausing occasionally to check the oven or adjust the heat beneath a pot on the stove. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor in slow strips as the hours passed. I drank 2 cups of coffee and read the newspaper, and felt the particular contentment of being in a room with someone you love, who is doing exactly what they want to be doing. Daniel Ross arrived at noon with a bottle of Sonoma County Pinot Noir, and the news that he had finally, after 11 years of meaning, to booked a trip to Portugal for January. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking faintly amazed at himself, as though he had not entirely believed he would go through with it until the confirmation email arrived. Elise told him Portugal in January was the right call, and that he should go to the Douro Valley if he had time. And Daniel said he would add it to the list, and the ease of that exchange, the ordinary friendliness of it, was something I noticed without remarking on. Patricia Okafor came up from the ground-floor apartment at 12:30 with a covered dish of jollof rice balanced in both hands, and the observation that the cranberry bread smelled exactly the way Thanksgiving was supposed to smell. Elise received this with a smile that reached all the way to the corners of her eyes, the unguarded kind that a person produces when they are not thinking about whether they are smiling correctly. We ate at the dining room table, the 4 of us gathered in the particular way of people who have not known each other long enough to have accumulated grievances, but have known each other long enough to be comfortable. The food was imperfect in the specific ways that homemade food always is. The chicken was slightly more done than Elise had intended. The cranberry bread was better than it had any right to be. The jollof rice was perfect. Nobody mentioned the chicken. Everybody had seconds of the rice. The afternoon light came through the window and lay itself across the tablecloth in long, warm strips and stayed there while we talked about Daniel's Portugal trip, and Patricia's son in Seattle, and the new management at the Glendale location, where Elise had recently been offered a shift supervisor position that she had accepted 2 weeks ago without calling to tell me until after she had already said yes. That had made me very happy. After the dishes were cleared and the leftovers divided into containers and the wine finished, Daniel and Patricia moved to the living room. I heard them settle into conversation, Patricia's low, deliberate voice and Daniel's occasional laugh, easy and unhurried, the way evenings go when no one has anywhere else to be. Elise and I stayed in the kitchen. She washed the roasting pan with her sleeves pushed up and her hands deep in the hot, soapy water, and I stood beside her and dried the things she handed me and put them away in the places they belonged. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the meal we had just finished. Outside the window, the November dark had settled over the backyard and the workshop and the old lemon tree by the fence. After a while, she turned off the tap and dried her hands carefully on the dish towel and looked at me with the direct, considered attention she had always had, the attention that was entirely her mother's. "Did you want me to leave that night?" she asked. "Because you thought I was a burden." She had been carrying that question for a year. I could hear the full weight of it in how carefully she said it, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed something many times and are finally ready to hear the answer. I set down the pan I was holding. "I wanted you to leave," I said, "because no one should live somewhere that uses the roof over their head as a weapon." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, not the quick nod of someone accepting an answer they are not entirely sure about, but the slower nod of someone placing something carefully in the right location where it can be found again when it is needed. I reached into the breast pocket of my shirt. I took out the envelope and placed it on the counter between us. Her hands went still against the counter's edge, still warm from the dishwater pressed flat, as though she needed the surface to be solid beneath them. She recognized the handwriting before she read the name. I could see it in the way her breath shifted, the small lift of her chin, the careful way her eyes moved to the single word written in her mother's particular slant across the front of the envelope. "Where did you find this?" Her voice came out barely above a murmur. "Her nightstand," I said. "4 years ago. I left it because it wasn't addressed to me." Elise picked it up, the envelope, the way you pick up something you are not certain you are ready for, slowly, with both hands, as though it might require steadying. She looked at me once more, a long, searching look that asked something she did not put into words. I nodded. She opened it. I watched her read. I watched her eyes move across the lines and stop and move again. I watched her press her lips together hard when she reached something that cost her. When she finished the first side, she turned the page over and read the second, and by the time she folded it back along the original creases, her eyes were bright, and her chin was unsteady, and one tear had made its way down her left cheek that she did not bother to wipe away. She looked up at me. "She knew," Elise said. Her voice broke on the second word. She already knew what I needed to hear. I reached across the counter and placed my hand over hers. "She usually did," I said. From the living room came the sound of Daniel laughing at something Patricia had said, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that fills a house and makes it feel inhabited in all the right ways. It moved through the kitchen and settled around us like something that had decided to stay. Elise looked down at the letter in her hands. Then she looked up at the photograph above the stove, Margaret, mid-laugh, caught by a camera she had not noticed, her dark hair loose entirely and completely herself. "Thank you for keeping it," Elise said quietly. "For waiting until it was time." I looked at the photograph too. "She did the hard part," I said. "She wrote it. I was in the workshop before the sun came up. Old habit. The kind that outlasts everything. Grief disruption, the particular exhaustion of a year that had asked more of me than I had anticipated when it began. I had slept well, which surprised me, and woken at 5 without an alarm, which did not. I dressed in the dark without thinking about it, the way you dress when your hands know the routine better than your mind does. Gray sweater, the old one, the one I had worn to the Mercer house on a November evening 12 months ago, when everything was still in place and nothing had yet broken open. I made coffee. I carried it out to the workshop. The November air outside was cold enough to see my breath, thin white clouds dispersing in front of me as I crossed the backyard. The grass was wet with dew. The old lemon tree at the corner of the fence still held a few pieces of fruit, bright yellow against the gray of the early morning, stubborn, in the way that old trees are stubborn, not defiant, just committed to continuing, because continuing is what they know how to do. The box was on the center of the workbench, where I had left it the night before, the final coat of oil, dry now, the brass hinge catching the light from the single overhead bulb in a way that satisfied me. I set my coffee down and ran my thumb along the lid's edge. The joint was clean, no gap, no give. The two pieces of oak fitted together the way things fit when you have taken the time to do them correctly and refused to rush the parts that needed patience. I had been building things with my hands for most of my adult life. Furniture cabinets, small repairs around the house that a younger man might have hired out, but that I preferred to handle myself. There was something in the work that I had never been able to explain adequately to anyone who did not already understand it, the way a well-fitted joint told you something true about effort, about the relationship between what you put in and what comes back to you. You could not fake a clean joint. The wood always knew. I opened the lid. The dark green felt inside. The small brass hinge catching and releasing smoothly. The space exactly large enough for what I intended to place there, not by accident, But because I had measured it twice before cutting the way Margaret used to say, I measured everything twice, and acted once, and meant it as a compliment, even when it came out sounding like a complaint. I reached into the breast pocket of my sweater and took out the envelope. Margaret's handwriting on the front, Elise's name in that particular slant I would recognize anywhere on any surface in any light. The paper was slightly soft now from a week of being carried close against my chest, warmed and worn at the edges in the small ways that paper wears when it has been handled by someone who kept reaching for it and then deciding not to open it yet. I had made a copy before giving the original to Elise the night before. A careful photocopy preserved in a folder in my office. The original had gone to Elise, her mother's handwriting, her mother's words belonging in her daughter's hands where Margaret had always intended it to land. But I had made myself a copy. Because some things you need to be able to return to. I placed the copy inside the box. I closed the lid. I stood at the workbench for a while with both hands resting flat on the surface and looked at what I had made. It was not a grand thing. It would not be displayed in anyone's home as a centerpiece or talked about at a dinner party. It was a small wooden box built by a 61-year-old man in a workshop behind a house in Pasadena, and it held a copy of a letter written by a woman who had known before any of the rest of us did what her daughter was going to need to hear. That seemed exactly right to me. I picked up my coffee and drank it standing at the workbench looking at the box. I thought about the year behind me. I had not fired Travis to punish him. I had not used the audit as a weapon or as leverage or as a way of settling a score that had been opened at a dinner table on a November night 12 months ago. I had not called Richard's attorney to accelerate consequences or to slow them down for my own satisfaction. I had not written a check to make Elise's problems disappear or offered her a room in my house indefinitely or done any of the things that would have felt like help from the outside, but functioned in practice like a longer version of the same leash she had already been on. I had done two things. I had brought my daughter to a building on a quiet street with old trees and lifted sidewalks, and a landlord who looked at her face and said, "She has your eyes." And I had watched Elise sign her name on a lease with a hand that trembled slightly, and press a key into her palm that belonged only to her. And I had let every other thing go where it was already going. Travis had told me to get a job. He had said it at a dinner table in front of his parents and his wife and a cousin visiting from San Diego, with the easy authority of a man who had looked at me and decided without much investigation that he already knew what I was worth. Richard had laughed and raised his glass. They had been so certain. That certainty had been their undoing long before I ever sat down at their table. People contain more than what you choose to see. I had said that once, looking directly at Travis across a Thanksgiving dinner that had gone sideways in ways none of us had fully predicted. And I had meant it simply as a statement of fact, plain and without drama, the kind of thing that is true, whether or not anyone in the room is ready to hear it. A year later, standing in my workshop in the early morning with a finished box in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow, I understood that it was not only a statement of fact, it was the only lesson that had ever really mattered. In business, in family, in the long and imperfect work of trying to be a decent person in a world that frequently mistakes simplicity for weakness and silence for surrender. Margaret had known it her whole life. She had carried it in the particular patience she brought to every person she encountered, in the way she listened without already preparing her response, in the way she never once looked at someone who was struggling and assumed she already understood the full shape of what they were carrying. She had known it so thoroughly that she had written it down in a letter she was not well enough to deliver herself in handwriting that still made my throat ache when I looked at it, because she wanted her daughter to have it in a form that would last. She had trusted that it would find its way. 32 years ago, I had started a company with 6 employees and a rented warehouse, and no particular guarantee that any of it would work. Margaret had been the one who looked at the numbers when the numbers were bad and said nothing about the numbers, and instead asked me whether I was still the man she married. She asked me that question more than once over the years, and never once did the asking feel like a challenge. It felt like someone holding a lamp at a doorway in the dark and saying, "I know the way back." Take your time. I had been taking my time ever since. I picked up the box. It was lighter than I expected, the way things made carefully often are, as though the patience goes into the object itself, and the weight comes out of you in the process of making it. I turned it over once in my hands, checking the underside, checking the corners where the grain met and held. Clean, solid, made to last. I turned off the workshop light. Outside, the morning had arrived without announcement, the way Pasadena mornings do in late November, cool and clear and unhurried. The sky, the particular pale blue that comes before the day, has fully committed to itself, the old trees along the back fence, still holding the last of their leaves in shades of amber and rust that caught the first light and held it briefly before letting it pass through. I stood on the step outside the workshop door with the box in my hands and breathed the morning air and listened to the neighborhood come slowly awake around me. A car started somewhere down the street, the particular cough and settle of an older engine finding its rhythm. A dog barked once from the yard, 2 houses over, and went quiet. A light came on in the house behind mine, yellow and warm behind a curtain, someone else beginning their morning in their own way, at their own pace. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Exactly right. I thought about Elise in her apartment on the 3rd floor 3 miles from here, waking up this morning in a room where everything on the walls she had put there herself and every key on her counter belonged to her, and no one was going to walk in and remind her that the roof above her head was not hers to rely on. I thought about Margaret's letter, which was now in 2 places at once, the original with Elise, where it had always been meant to go, and the copy here in the box under my arm where I could keep returning to it on the mornings when I needed to be reminded of what she already knew. I thought about Travis and Richard and the long chain of choices that had led each of them to where they now stood, and I felt nothing toward either of them that I could honestly call anger. What I felt was closer to the particular sadness that arrives when you watch someone spend years building a version of the world based on a wrong assumption, and then have to live in the wreckage when the assumption finally collapses. They had assumed that what a person appeared to have was the same as what a person was worth. That assumption had cost them everything. I walked back toward the house in my gray sweater with the box under my arm through the cool November morning, the dew still on the grass, the lemon tree still holding its fruit, the pale blue sky beginning to deepen toward the blue it would become by mid-morning when the day finally made up its mind about itself. The day opened up ahead of me the way days do when you are no longer spending all of your energy holding something together that was never yours to hold in the first place. I went inside. I put the box on the kitchen windowsill beside the blue vase where the yellow roses were beginning to open fully now, one day after I had brought them home and trimmed the stems the way Margaret had taught me at an angle underwater, so the cut would not seal before the flower could drink. The kitchen was quiet. The photograph above the stove showed Margaret mid-laugh at someone's birthday party, her dark hair loose, entirely unaware of the camera. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat down at the table where so much of this had begun, and so much of it had been worked through, and so much of it had finally, at the cost of a full and difficult year, found its way to something that felt less like an ending and more like the right kind of beginning. Outside the window, the morning light fell across the roses and the vase and the small wooden box and the quiet kitchen and kept moving the way light does, passing through without asking permission, illuminating everything it touches for exactly as long as it needs to. Looking back on everything that happened, I think about what God placed in my path that Thanksgiving night, not to punish anyone, but to show me that silence is its own kind of choice, and every choice carries a cost. I spent too many years believing that love meant absorbing everything quietly. If you recognize yourself in any part of this family drama revenge on either side of the table, please hear this and should not wait as long as I did. The longer you wait, the higher the price. These family stories revenge situations do not arrive with a warning. They build slowly in small remarks, in things people stop bothering to hide, when they believe you have nothing left to give. That is the truest test of character I have ever witnessed. My personal belief is this: in every family story's revenge story, the real turning point is never the confrontation. It is the quiet moment when one person finally decides they are worth protecting. If you have lived through your own family drama revenge experience, I want to hear it. Leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs it. And if content like this speaks to you, please subscribe to the channel. There are more family stories and revenge stories coming that go straight to the heart. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and personal growth. If this type of content is not the right fit for you, we respect that completely. Please feel free to find content that serves you better.